The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a medical experiment conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service in Alabama from 1932 to 1972. 600 African American men, mostly poor and illiterate, were recruited for a study on syphilis treatment. Researchers told the men they were being treated for bad blood and didn't inform them they had syphilis or that the study was actually a placebo trial. Participants were deliberately left untreated for 40 years, despite the availability of effective treatment like penicillin. Researchers observed the natural progression of syphilis, taking notes as the men suffered from severe symptoms, blindness, and death. The men were not given informed consent, and the study was conducted without their knowledge or permission. The eugenics program in the U.S., which aimed to improve the human race through forced sterilization and other means, disproportionately targeted Black people, Latin individuals, indigenous people, and people with disabilities. This dark chapter in American history has had long-lasting impacts on marginalized communities, including ongoing healthcare disparities and systemic inequalities. In the 1940s and 50s, at Wippenholm, a former mental hospital in Sweden, patients were subjected to various experiments, including when the Swedish government force-fed special needs kids candy to see how their teeth would degenerate, including extra sticky toffee. The experiments were sponsored by the sugar industry and the dentist community. Think of all that wasted candy on people who probably didn't appreciate it. Walter Freeman and his infamous ice pick lobotomies. The cutting-edge procedure he developed, the transorbital lobotomy, a type of psychosurgery that involves inserting a thin instrument, often an ice pick, into the eye socket and severing or scraping away parts of the brain. Freeman marketed this as a miracle cure for mental illness, such as depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. Walter Freeman performed over 3,500 lobotomies, and about 490 patients died. The Kentler experiment was a controversial project conducted by Helmut Kentler in Berlin, Germany during the late 1960s. The project involved placing neglected teenage boys in the care of adult male foster parents who were known as pedophiles. Kentler believed that the boys would benefit from the attention and care of these men, despite the likelihood of sexual contact. The experiment was widely criticized for its unethical and harmful nature, and it led to widespread outrage and calls for accountability. The Depakine scandal, a major public health controversy in France that involved the anti-epileptic drug Depakine. The scandal centered on the drug's use during pregnancy, which was linked to birth defects and developmental disorders in children. Despite warnings from health professionals, the drug was continued to be prescribed to pregnant women. The investigation, which lasted for 8 years, found that between 2006 and 2014, that 425 to 450 babies suffered from birth defects or were stillborn. Many more children may have been affected, but the exact number is unknown. The drug's manufacturer was aware of the risks, but failed to adequately warn patients and healthcare professionals. Essure, the controversial contraceptive implant, developed by Bayer, formerly Conceptus. Essure was approved by the FDA in 2002 and was marketed as a permanent, non-reversible form of birth control. However, it was later discovered that the device was not as safe as claimed, and thousands of women experienced severe side effects. In the US, Bayer faced numerous lawsuits and paid significant settlements to affected women. However, many women in Brazil and other countries where Essure was marketed did not receive the same compensation or support. Pavlov. Everyone knows about the dog experiments, but not about him experimenting on homeless children, surgically externalizing a salivary gland. Additionally, the children were exposed to various stimuli, including food and other substances, to observe their salivary responses. 1994 plutonium experiments conducted by the U.S. Department of Energy. In these experiments, 18 people, including some with mental disabilities, were injected with plutonium without their knowledge or consent. This was done to study the effects of plutonium on the human body. The Bikini Islanders. The Bikini Islanders story is a tragic example of the devastating consequences of nuclear testing and colonialism. The Bikini Islanders were forcibly relocated from their ancestral home, Bikini Atoll, in the Marshall Islands, in the 1940s to make way for U.S. nuclear testing. The testing, which included the infamous Bravo test in 1954, contaminated the atoll and exposed the islanders to harmful radiation. The islanders suffered from radiation sickness, displacement, and long-term health effects, including birth defects and cancer. They were eventually resettled on other islands, but their way of life and cultural heritage was forever changed. The Stanford experiment. The psychological study involved recruiting students to play the role of either prisoner or guard in a simulated prison environment. The experiment was meant to last 2 weeks, but it was stopped just after 6 days due to extreme behavior of the guards and the psychological distress experienced by the prisoners. The Milgram experiment. In this study, participants were instructed to administer electric shocks to another person, an actor, every time they answered a question incorrectly, despite the actor's cries of pain and pleas to stop. Many participants continued to administer increasingly severe shocks, simply because an authority figure told them to do so. The Okuchi experiment. In 1996, a Japanese man named Hashimoto Isamu was abducted and held captive for 83 days by a group of individuals who claimed to be conducting a psychological experiment. It was later revealed that the experiment was actually a hoax, and the perpetrators were arrested and charged with kidnapping and assault. During his captivity, he was subjected to physical and psychological abuse, including being forced to wear a diaper and being subjected to sensory deprivation. The Okuchi case has been compared to the Stanford prison experiment and the Milgram experiment. The monster study. This experiment involved intentionally inducing stuttering in 22 orphan children to investigate the causes of stuttering. The children were divided into 2 groups, with one group receiving positive speech therapy and the other group receiving negative speech therapy. The experiment was widely criticized for its unethical treatment of vulnerable children. The Little Albert experiment. Another controversial and influential study in the history of psychology. In 1920, John Watson and Rosalie Rain conducted an experiment on a 9-month-old baby, Albert B., to investigate classical conditioning and the development of phobias. They exposed Albert to various stimuli, including loud noises and white rats, to condition him to fear certain objects. Women's suffrage. Duh. Fort Derrick is a United States Army Futures Command installation located in Frederick, Maryland. It was the center of the U.S. biological weapons program from 1943 to 1969 and currently hosts most elements of the United States biological defense program. Few key points. Anthrax research there as a biological weapon during World War II and other biological agents. In the 1950s, Fort Derrick conducted experiments on human subjects, including Seventh-day Adventists, to test biological agents and develop vaccines. That was called Operation Whitecoat. The base was also involved in research using insects as vectors for biological warfare, including the use of mosquitoes to spread diseases. In 1989, researchers at Fort Derrick identified the Ebola virus in monkeys imported from the Philippines. In 2001, the base was involved in an investigation of the anthrax attacks that killed 5 people, and one of the researchers, Bruce Edwards Ivins, was later identified as the perpetrator. Fort Derrick has been listed as a Superfund site due to contamination with volatile organic compounds and other hazardous materials. John Money was a controversial psychologist and sexologist who was known for his work on gender and sexuality. In 1955, he coined the term gender to distinguish it from biological sex. Money's most infamous case involved twin boys, Bruce and Brian Reamer, who were born in 1965. After a botched circumcision, Bruce's genitals were severely damaged, and Money convinced the parents to raise Bruce as a girl, renaming him Brenda. Money's goal was to prove that gender was solely a social construct, and that a child could be successfully reassigned a different gender. As part of his research, Money forced the twins to engage in simulated sexual activities, with Brenda playing the role of the female and Brian playing the male. This was done to prove that gender was learned behavior. Tragically, both twins struggled with their gender identities and suffered depression and anxiety. In 2004, Brenda, who had since reverted to living as a male named David, committed suicide at the age of 38. His twin brother Brian died by suicide in 2002 at the age of 36. Rat Utopia. In 1960, Dr. Calhoun created a controlled environment for rats, providing them with unlimited food, water, and space in an effort to create a rat utopia. However, instead of thriving, the rats eventually exhibited a range of abnormal behaviors, including withdrawal, loss of purpose, increased aggression, sexual dysfunction, collapse of social structure, until eventually this experiment was stopped after about 2 years and the rats were euthanized. During World War I, various chemical weapons were tested and used on soldiers and civilians, including mustard gas, sarin gas, and chlorine gas. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 banned the use of chemical weapons in warfare, but their development and testing continued in secret. The U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, has been implicated in a controversial population control program in Peru in the 1990s. The program, which was funded by the USAID and implemented by the Peruvian government, aimed to reduce population growth in Peru. Over 200,000 women were subjected to tubal ligations without their full and informed consent. Women were often not told that the procedure was permanent or that it would render them unable to bear children. Women were pressured into undergoing sterilization in exchange for food, medicine, or other benefits. The program disproportionately affected marginalized communities. The Willowbrook Hepatitis Study. Mentally retarded children housed at the Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York, were intentionally given hepatitis in an attempt to track the development of the viral infection. The study began in 1956 and lasted for 14 years. The children were not provided with any treatment or care, and many suffered from serious illness and death as a result. Gain-of-function research of bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Gain-of-function research involves modifying a virus or other pathogen to enhance its ability to infect cells or increase its transmissibility. In the case of the WIV, researchers were studying bat coronaviruses to understand their potential to infect humans. The research, led by Dr. Shi Shengli, involved experimenting with bat coronaviruses to see if they could be made to infect human cells. The goal was to understand the risks of these viruses and potentially develop vaccines or therapies. However, some have raised concerns that this research could have inadvertently created a more dangerous virus, potentially leading to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's important to note that the scientific community is still divided on the origins of COVID-19, and there is no conclusive evidence to prove that the WIV's research was responsible for the pandemic. The World Health Organization, the National Institute of Health, and other reputable health organizations have called for a thorough investigation into the origins of COVID-19, and research is ongoing to determine the origins of the virus. Operation Sea Spray was a covert operation conducted by CIA in the 1950s and 60s, involving the use of biological agents to manipulate the behavior of individuals and populations. The operation involved the spraying of biological agents involving viruses and bacteria into the air and water supplies of targeted areas, with the goal of inducing psychological and physical effects such as hallucinations, confusion, disorientation, nausea, vomiting. The CIA aimed to use these methods to control human behavior, induce mass hysteria, create chaos and disorder, manipulate public opinion. Operation Sea Spray, a part of CIA's larger MK Ultra program, which involved a range of experiments and operations focused on mind control, behavioral modifications, and psychological warfare. The existence of Operation Sea Spray was denied by the CIA for years, but documents about the program were eventually declassified and made public, revealing the disturbing scope of the agency's activities. MK Ultra, the secret mind control program that involved the use of drugs, hypnosis, and other methods to manipulate the behavior of individuals. Operation Mockingbird, a program to influence the media and shape public opinion by recruiting journalists and planting stories. Project Artichoke from 1951 to 1954 focused on hypnosis and mind control using various techniques, including drugs, sensory deprivation, and hypnosis to create programmed agents. There was Project Chaos, 1969 to 1974, a domestic surveillance program that used illegal tactics, break-ins, and mail tampering to gather intel on U.S. citizens and political dissidents. Project MK Delta from 1960 to 1970, a program that focused on using behavioral modification techniques, including drugs and hypnosis, to create super spies and control human behavior. Project Stargate, 1978 to 1995, a program that aimed to use remote viewing and psychic abilities for military intelligence gathering, including attempting to locate targets and predict enemy movements. It's been said the CIA has involvement in the creation and manipulation of Charles Manson and his followers, known as the Manson family. Manson was a participant in the CIA's MK-Ultra program. Manson's followers were subjected to mind control techniques similar to those used in MK-Ultra experiments. Several individuals with alleged CIA connections were associated with Manson, including his parole officer. Manson's ability to control his followers and his unusual behavior have led some to speculate that he's a product of the CIA mind control experiments. Operation Midnight Climax. In 1950s and 60s, the CIA conducted a series of secret experiments using LSD and other drugs to study the effects on human behavior. In one of these experiments, CIA agents dosed unsuspecting citizens in San Francisco with LSD without their knowledge or consent. Henry A. Murray, a prominent Harvard psychologist, led the experiment that Ted Kaczynski was a part of as a young man and was also involved in the CIA intelligence agency's Project MK-Ultra. The experiment aimed to assess the effects of stress on the human psyche, involved humiliating undergraduates, and was part of a larger CIA program exploring mind control techniques. Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, was a participant in the psychological experiment at Harvard University in 1959. The experiment involved 22 students who was subject to intense psychological pressure and stress over a period of 200 hours. Kaczynski has said that the experiment was a traumatic experience for him, and some have speculated that it may have contributed to his later actions as the Unabomber. Operation Paperclip was a U.S. program that recruited scientists from Nazi Germany and brought them to the United States after World War II without fully scrutinizing their past activities. Werner von Braun, a former Nazi scientist, led the development of the Saturn V rocket that put the U.S. on the moon during the Apollo program. The recruitment of Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip was a controversial decision. The Nazi regime experiments include hypothermia experiments. Prisoners at Dachau and Auschwitz were subjected to extreme cold temperatures to study hypothermia's effects. Prisoners at Buchenwald were subjected to high-voltage electric shocks to study the effects of electricity on the human body. The medical experiments conducted by Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz concentration camp during World War II. Mengele's research focused on genetics and heredity, with a particular interest in twins. He believed that studying twins could provide insights into the genetic factors that influence various traits and diseases. However, his methods were brutal and unethical, involving forced experiments. He subjected twins to invasive and painful procedures, such as blood draws, injections, and surgeries without anesthesia or consent. Twins were separated from their families and placed in special barracks, where they were subjected to experimentation and observation. Mengele's attempt to create an artificial twin by injecting chemicals into the eyes of non-twin prisoners to change their eye color. Many twins were killed and dissected, with their organs and body parts preserved for further study. Mengele's actions were a gross violation of human rights, ethics, and medical standards. His research was not only unethical, but also scientifically flawed and useless. The international community has widely condemned his actions, and his name has become synonymous with the horrors of the Holocaust. Unit 731 was a secret military unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that conducted biological and chemical warfare research during World War II. It was responsible for some of the most notorious war crimes in history. According to historical records, Nazi officials, including Heinrich Himmler, were briefed on Unit 731's activities. during a visit to Japan in 1942. They were reportedly horrified by the scale and brutality of the experiments and urged the Japanese to stop, or at least to scale back their program. The Nazis themselves were engaged in inhumane experiments, such as those conducted by Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz, but they seemed to view Unit 731's work as particularly extreme and unnecessary. Unit 731 conducted experiments on thousands of people, including civilians, prisoners of war, mental health patients. These experiments included performing surgical procedures without anesthesia, testing new weapons and toxins on humans. Prisoners were subjected to dehydration to determine the percentage of water in the human body. These experiments were designed to determine the maximum amount of time a person could survive without water and to calculate the percentage of water in the human body. However, the experiments were conducted without any scientific rigor or ethical oversight and were intended solely to satisfy the curiosity of Unit 731's researchers. Researchers tested the limits of human endurance by removing multiple organs, including lungs, livers, and intestines, to see how long the patient could survive. Prisoners were subjected to unnecessary and brutal surgeries, such as grafting skin from one person to another. The full extent of Unit 731's atrocities is still not fully known, as many records were destroyed or hidden after the war. The unit's activities were highly classified, and the Japanese government denied its existence until the 1990s. It's estimated that thousands of people were killed or suffered severe injuries as a result of the unit's experiments. The leaders of Unit 731 were granted immunity from prosecution by the United States in exchange for their cooperation in sharing their research and expertise. It's ironic that the Nazis, who were responsible for some of the most horrific atrocities in history, were appalled by the actions of Unit 731. This serves as a reminder that the scope of human cruelty and depravity can be boundless, and that even those responsible for great evil can recognize and be shocked by the excess of others.